Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. The U.S. has a long history of trading with numerous nations with poor records on human rights and shoddy business and credit relationships. The list is very, very long. We import considerable amounts of oil from Nigeria, from Venezuela, despite their shoddy records on human rights and political freedom. Pakistan itself is the recipient of billions of dollars in American aid, despite Islamabad's long history of repressing political freedom. Indeed, at one point, the United States traded with Iraq, even during the height of Saddam Hussein's brutality against Kurdish and Shiite communities. Yet, despite our long and continued history of doing business with nations with questionable or even poor records on human rights, and I might add, China is a glaring example of this. This nation of Cuba has been singled out for a trade embargo because of its human rights issues and problems. Is there a double standard, and why is there a double standard? Ms. Roscoff, would you please respond to my question?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, you're absolutely right. The U.S. does have a history of engaging with many countries around the world in which human rights problems exist or political prisoners are unjustly deprived of their freedoms. And we have chosen another path, engagement. From China to Saudi Arabia, from North Korea to Afghanistan, we choose to engage to help advocate for those who have been abused by their systems. Engaging brings more of these stories to light. Engagement brings countries more fully into the international community where established systems and multilateral mechanisms can work on behalf of the victims. I think we have to acknowledge that the embargo has failed to help the political prisoners in Cuba, and it's actually hurt the average Cuban by damaging the economy. But it hasn't damaged it enough to change things in the mind of the governments. It's just damaged it to hurt the innocents in the country. So I do say, yes, we have had a double standard.
Mr. Thal, should we subject some of these other countries to similar embargoes? Should we stop importing oil from Venezuela or Nigeria or even Saudi Arabia? Should we issue a trade embargo with China, and what would the effect of that be to the economy of our nation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's actually a really good question. I think it's a good question because it underscores the extent to which we ought to strive to have a single standard in how we approach trade and human rights and diplomacy issues around the world. I think our view is that there are limited selective occasions where sanctions do make sense. I think by and large, sanctions haven't been effective forms of coercion against governments with whom we have disagreements. I think Cuba is one of the clearest examples of that. And I think the message is we ought to engage with countries, and as part of that engagement, have human rights on the explicit agenda. We ought to do that with Cuba, we ought to do it with China, and we ought to do it around the world.
Perspective on the possibility of the President's recent pronouncement as it relates to the telecommunications industry. How do you foresee that from two vantage points? One from the vantage point of the American corporations, and two from the vantage point of the Cuban people.
First, just a minor point. American cell phones won't work in Cuba. So we could send all the cell phones we want, but it's not going to do any good. I mean, it ignores the fact that Cuba has a 12-year now joint venture with Italy, which is in the process of redoing the whole telecommunications system in Cuba. They've launched a cell phone system. It doesn't cover the entire country and covers the major population centers. There's been installations of public phones and an upgrade of telephone communications hardware. So U.S. companies are going into a market where there already is a foreign investor. Sometimes we tend to think if we're not there, nobody's there, but that's not the case in Cuba. Having said that, I've talked to Cuban officials who recognize that we're 1 million Americans to come to Cuba in free travel. They're going to have to make changes so that they can service Americans in their cell phones, which will mean a joint venture between some American company and Itexa and the Italian company there to widen the cell phone coverage, to engage in a business agreement and finances going back and forth for the expansion of that coverage, and to install a system where U.S. cell phones will work. But again, American companies will be going into a situation that has been working for 12 years.
My time is up. I want to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Case, and welcome to you and everybody else here to the committee. I do have a question regarding your testimony. You mentioned in your testimony a Reuters report that Cuba may be in a fiscal crisis and near insolvency. At top of the fact, on top of the fact that it already has $25 billion in unpaid debt and owes an additional $22 billion in Cold War era unpaid debts, why are other countries still doing business like this Italian company with Cuba if they're not being repaid, if that's indeed the case?
Well, what Cuba's been doing, even when I was there, we saw it all the time. They will take products from foreign countries. They will wait as long as they can to pay them and pay them a little bit or try to restructure the debt. They did that with Mexico, for example. It's a constant sort of kiting in the sense that they have so much debt and so little productivity and so little of what they export that's not already being sold that they don't have the money they need to provide for all these great markets that people have been talking about. The fact is they're tremendously indebted. There is no consumer demand because the average Cuban has no money, can barely survive. So it all depends on the whims of the government. And Fidel buys on political grounds, particularly from the United States, because he's trying to influence votes in Congress. And where he buys depends on what a lot of calculations he made where it's going to get the main bang for the buck.
Thank you, Mr. Case. If American business, including agribusiness, were not required to accept cash-only terms of business and instead started giving credit to Cuba, what do you see happening under that scenario?
Well, I think any company that would want to not take cash before they even ship the goods, when all these other companies are having great difficulty getting money, would be nuts. I mean, they have the best deal going, and I think that what would happen is we start running up huge debts with Cuba, and they may or may not pay us, depending on like they do with the rest of the world.
Can you tell me whether there would be more than credit risks involved if cash was not required for purchases of
Well, the
American
real risk
goods?
is this is not a market that's making decisions. This is Fidel and Raul who decide who gets paid, who gets booted out. When I was there was a move after many years to dissuade Spanish small and medium businesses from remaining. That's why in the figures we heard earlier, there's a large number of companies that have left. And it's because they decided that it's time for them to go. They changed their mind.
Thank you, Mr. Case. And you mentioned also in your testimony a point which I would like you to elaborate on, if you would, please, and that is that to invest in Cuba today is to participate in the exploitation of defenseless Cuban workers, and that there would be a backlash against Canadian, Spanish, and other investors who've taken advantage of the docile Cuban labor to make a fast buck. Could you expand on that, please?
I've talked to a lot of people in Cuba when I was there and since then who tell me that when the day comes and when there's freedom in Cuba, the fact that the United States, on principle, did not exploit Cuban labor the way I mentioned it, will be seen as a favorable development for American companies. But that the Spanish and others who've taken advantage that you can't strike, that you can't have labor organizations, are going to not have the sympathy of the general public afterwards. And how that plays out, we'll have to see. And I would remind you also that Lech Walesa has written a letter to the president recently saying, please don't forget the situation of labor rights in Cuba when you talk about changing your policy toward Cuba, and I think that's very important.
All right, thank you, Mr. Case. And Ms. Rothkopf, I couldn't help but notice in your testimony on the Chamber's desire to do business in Cuba that you would want to be able to do business. A couple minor things to get out of the way, that would be that there's a long list here. The Cuban government will have to provide certain guarantees and safeguards to U.S. business in the areas of rule of law, the environmental protection, infrastructure for travel requirements, intellectual property protection, and incentives for innovation and labor rights. Also, important considerations regarding financing. That's quite a long list. I mean, care to comment on that? I mean, you know, that's that's a pretty high barrier to overcome.
Sure. I think the reason that that was included in my testimony was to make the point that we think that opening trade with Cuba is going to bring political and economic change to the island. But just because we were to open and make that option available, that doesn't mean that everybody is going to rush in and automatically do business. And I think that the important thing is to say that we don't place that limit on other countries, on businesses. Businesses will make a smart decision based on business decisions and whether it makes sense for their company. A company that doesn't have the safety requirements that they need, they're going to stop operating. If they're not getting the intellectual property protection that they need, then they're not going to continue to do business with that country. If the infrastructure isn't there for the travel requirements, they're not going to go in. So basically what we're saying is U.S. businesses are successful because they take a smart look at the business opportunities. And my point is that they are going to continue to take a smart look at the opportunities, and they're going to make a smart decision based on what the Cuban government decides to do or not to do.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Chair, thanks to the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all very much for being here today. Following President Obama's announcement that lifting of the restriction on Cuban American families and their ability to travel to Cuba, it's been met at home with great enthusiasm. And I wanted to give you one example of a newspaper headline that followed within the week. It's from the Tampa Tribune, but it had a similar message in many other papers. Thirst for Cuba trade and travel. And I think folks at home they're very hopeful for the economic opportunity that modernization of the relationship will bring eventually. Great potential in the ports in Florida, ag products, all products, the cruise industry, etc. But I think because of the family ties and historic ties that we have, folks do not want economic opportunity to come at the expense of progress and change on the island, especially human rights. So now, where are we? President Obama appeared at the Summit of the Americas and made another overture, met rather surprisingly with a response from the Cuban president that said everything's on the table, followed up by Brother Fidel Castro said, well, wait a minute. If you all are advising the Obama administration and the Congress now on how to proceed, what is the plan? It's unlikely that it's going to come just a lifting of the embargo. That may not practically happen. So what is the plan? What are we going to be seeking on human rights improvement, and where can we make progress? And if you all could each take about 45 seconds to answer.
Well, I think the embargo has always been a tool, and both President Bush and I think reiterated by President Obama has said that if we see evidence that the Cuban government is serious about engaging, it takes two to tango, gives us a sign and begins moving in the direction of where we want to see Cuba, which is greater freedom and economic prosperity for the Cuban people, then everything is open for discussion. But Hillary Clinton said a couple days ago in a hearing that she's seen no response yet from Cuba, and Fidel keeps undercutting his little brother by saying he didn't mean that. He's still in control, and I think he's made it clear from day one of his administration that he said, when this war is over, I'll start a longer and bigger war of my own, the war I'm going to fight against them. I realize that will be my true destiny. Fidel, will continue to do everything he can to sabotage, I think, a closer engagement between the two countries.
Me? Okay, thank you. I completely agree with you. We don't want the economic opportunities to come at the expense of the possibilities of democracy. But we actually believe that broadening economic engagement with the island through additional commercial and people-to-people contacts will promote the transition to democracies and to full civil liberties. We very much hope to see an end to the embargo. Absence a full end to the embargo, there are some steps that can be taken, for example, removing the restrictions on financing, allowing the ability to travel for the purpose of establishing commercial relationships, allowing visits from Cuban officials to confer with U.S. suppliers, inspect facilities, and discuss sanitary and phytosanitary issues. All of these would all have a positive effect.
Similarly, I don't expect that the process of political opening in Cuba I don't expect that the process of political opening in Cuba is going to be a tit-for-tat series of movements by the United States and the Cuban government back and forth. My view is we will see political change there and political opening and relaxation as the U.S. moves forward in its relationship. I think we ought to move forward pursuing our own interests, which have to do with maintaining human rights as a concern of ours and being very clear and public about that, pursuing some common interests around migration, drug cooperation and environmental concerns, and moving forward in pursuit of our economic interests. And I think in that process, we'll see change movement beginning in Cuba. But I don't think we'll see it as a back and forth tit-for-tat kind of process.
Can I just add a couple comments? If there are preconditions, if we are going to say to Cuba, we're not going to do this until you do that, that means two things. That means, one, we have put into Cuba's hands how we conduct our foreign policy, because we're letting them set the conditions. Secondly, it's a non-starter. Cuba will not respond to any preconditions and have said so repeatedly. President Obama did something that no other president since John Kennedy has done, which is to say publicly that the policy over 50 years has been a failure. In response to that, Raul Castro said everything's on the table, something that no Cuban president has said for 50 years. Raul Castro was president of Cuba. He has an older brother who has no official office in managing the government. I think it would be a mistake to take an editorial or a column in Granma and interpret that as being the final word on Cuban government policy. I think we ought to take them up on their word. I think there's a way to begin in terms of talking about resurrecting the bilateral talks that the previous administration stopped on immigration, drug interdiction, and the environment, all to our interest. And we ought to begin the process of talking in the same way that Ronald Reagan, in calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, still kept on talking.
Thank you.
Time is up. The Chairman, I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey, Dr. Gingrey, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I want to thank all the witnesses of this second panel. I happen to disagree with Ms. Rothkopf, Mr. Thale, Mr. Jones, and do fully, completely agree with Ambassador Kaysen. But that's the way life is. You have your opinion, and you feel very strongly about it, and we have to go on. I do want to commend Ambassador Kaysen for 38 years' experience in the Foreign Service, mostly in Latin America and some time in Cuba, and Chief of Mission from 2003 to 2006. I think that gives him a pretty darn good insight into what's going on. And I think his comments about labor and the problem in regard to labor violations in Cuba, I made the analogy in regard to why we didn't ratify the free trade agreement, bilateral trade agreement with Colombia, and that the Democratic majority Mr. Chairman. It keeps blocking that, and it's mainly over labor issues. So it seems a little disingenuous that we would be wanting to open up trade with Cuba when their labor record is deplorable, abhorrent. I want to specifically ask Ambassador Kaysen, though, what do you think the current credit worthiness of Cuba is, and what is on the horizon that will give us faith that Cuba can afford to pay its debts? If you could quickly, in about 30 seconds, answer that, I would appreciate it.
The credit rating is terrible. It couldn't get lower, and I don't think there's anything on the horizon that's going to bring the big bucks that would allow us to have having Cuba the natural trading partner that someday it will be when Cuba's free and has the right economic policies that allow for growth and human ingenuity and entrepreneurs that are repressed there. But right now there's nothing. So I think that it's wishful thinking that the money will just appear and that we'll all get paid. I'd like to say that I used to run trade promotion for the U.S. government in Southern Europe. I worked for 3 years as the head of trade promotion. So I'm all in favor of businesses making a buck. I'm also interested in them getting paid and not giving up human rights in the process just to make a buck on a market that's extremely small, is shrinking, and is not going to grow other than by some miracle that I don't know where that's going to come from.
Absolutely. Well, let me just say this too. I think the other three witnesses are talking about basically what sounds to me is the end justifies the means, and that sanctions haven't worked. And I would suggest to them that sanctions do work when they're implied across the board, and maybe the people that are out of step are the other countries of the Western Hemisphere and Europe that were not willing, did not have the intestinal fortitude to apply the sanctions. Mr. Jones, you referenced John Fitzgerald Kennedy. You and I are probably about the same age. We were probably in our early 20s when Fidel Castro allowed Nikita Khrushchev to put those ballistic missiles on that island 90 miles from our shore and aim them right at us. So I think the courage was, of course, on the part of President Kennedy, probably spinning in his grave today, listening to some of this testimony. I'm not specifically asking you a question, but if you want to respond in just a second, I'll let you. Let me go on to Mr. Thale, though. There's something in your testimony, Mr. Thale, that really, really bothered me. You said that, to reference in the United States State Department Human Rights Report, in your written testimony it says, although that report criticizes Cuba's treatment of prisoners, the State Department Human Rights Report does not allege that the Cuban government engages in torture. And then in parentheses you have an issue with which we are grappling here in the United States. And in your verbal testimony, and if you don't recall it, we can, Mr. Chairman, have the transcriber read it back to us. You referenced Guantanamo Bay. Were you suggesting, Mr. Thale, that in the previous administration that President Bush or anybody a part of that was endorsing torture, that we were torturing people? Is that what you were suggesting?
Well, I was suggesting, Mr. Gingrey, that there's a debate going on in the United States about the documents that have just been released. There's the whole Abu Ghraib debate, and this is an issue that's clearly under discussion in the United States. And I think the general thrust of my testimony was that if you look at the human rights situation in Cuba, you see a set of serious problems which have to do, as I said, with freedom of association, freedom of the press, free expression, political prisoners, but that there's a set of, in the universe of human rights issues that are under debate in the world today, there's some that Cuba's...
Well, reclaim my time. I just want to say in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, that I'm getting a little weary of people that represent this government going around the country talking about what we do and how we're guilty of human rights violations and apologizing for the previous administration. I think that's entirely inappropriate, and I yield back.
Do the gentleman yield?
Of course, I'll yield to the chairman.
Dr. Green, you're a good friend of mine, but I just want to bring your attention to a matter in my home state of Illinois, where there is a fellow by the name of John Burge, who's a former police commander, and he has recently been indicted after about 30 years for torturing American citizens and forcing them to confess to crimes, and some have served for many years on death row your friend or Republican Governor George Ryan, who's also convicted now. He's a friend of mine. But one of the things that he did, I really admire him for, that he freed all the prisoners on death row because a lot of them were there because of torture. And so this does occur in all countries, and so and even in our own country. And right now, there's a current real issue in my own state of Illinois, in the city of Chicago. You're probably not mindful of that, but I just, for the record, wanted to reflect that. Thank you so much. I yield back. The time of the gentleman is expired, and now we'll recognize the gentleman who's just joined us, Mr. Scalise, who's joined us from Louisiana. Mr. Scalise, you are recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would first ask comment that Mr. Jones made a few minutes ago about who's calling the shots, I guess, in Cuba. Do you really suggest that Fidel Castro is not in some way in control of the government of Cuba?
I am suggesting that he remains as head of the Communist Party, but he is not president of Cuba. There's been a whole new wave of people brought in. Does that mean that Raul Castro does not consult his older brother? Absolutely. I'm sure he does. But I think it would be a mistake to take his writings in Grandma as necessarily reflecting the absolute position of the Cuban government. And I think just as President Obama did not take the statements of Mr. Gibbs and Mr. Restrepo, which were fairly hard line, but he put forth a different view of what his view was in terms of the relationship with Cuba. And I think we should wait. The U.S. government should wait for the official response from Raul Castro or his ministers in terms of how they want to proceed.
And I would still doubt that Fidel is removed from giving orders or having a direct say in how the government's running. But I do think as we look at and debate this proposal to change U.S. policy that's been in effect for decades, I think we need to look at a broad range of issues, not just the economic issues, but the political issues and also the impact it would have on Americans who live here today who were literally run out of Cuba, who still have very vivid memories of their property being taken, their families being threatened, in some cases detained, and all of the things that they escaped, and what this would mean to them, the people that are contributing to our economy, who are active citizens in their communities, who are business owners, and who have taken offense, and many have expressed very publicly the offense they would have to assisting this Castro government, whether it's Fidel or Raul. It's still the Castro government that's running and keeping the reins over the citizens there. I don't know if any of y'all have consulted the different Cuban American communities throughout our country to.
The only thing we know, the only thing those people know, is that
which people?
The people who are concerned about their property being confiscated and families and the problems of the early '60s. The only thing we know after 50 years almost is that none of those problems have been solved with the current policy. The confiscation of property, for example. First, not a single trademark has been confiscated. There are 5,000 registered trademarks of U.S. brands in Cuba that are maintained today, and I've taken companies down to the Cuban Chamber of Commerce and other places.
And I apologize to cut you off. My time's running out. Ambassador Kason's had his hand up.
I think the embargo was put in place, of course, originally because of confiscation of U.S. properties. Jones mentioned nickel. That was one of the properties that was seized from American government at the time. I'd like to make the point that nobody's policies have been able to budge Fidel Castro from the course that he's been on. 50 years, the rest of the world except us has pursued a policy of engagement in trade and tourism. My question is, where's the beef? They've been doing this for 50 years. We're the only ones that haven't. And people say now we should do something different and Castro will change. It's not, we don't have a magic pixie dust to make that happen. It's because this is the nature of this guy. It's too bad that nobody's policies worked. But I think when they're gone, what's left of the embargo will be a leverage on the military, because it's a military dictatorship, those guys will see their vested interest in moving the country in the right direction so that we can liberate the hordes of American tourists that we would like to see go there.
For Mr. Thale and Ms. Rothkopf, I know China, Venezuela, other countries are doing business in Cuba today. We've heard testimony about the average per capita income. If you can address that as well, and what types of consumers are in the country that we could even be doing business with if we went down that road. What types of products do China, Venezuela, other countries provide that aren't available, or what are they not providing where there even would be a role for America to play, and then to what type of consumer base is out there?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to think about in terms of what the U.S. can provide that isn't being provided by other countries is to think about our proximity. And in my testimony, I identified a number of areas, including agriculture, for example. Cuba has the potential to become the top foreign market for U.S. rice, for example. We discussed tourism, machinery, oil. I think we talked about biotechnology. There's a whole host of products that we can provide, including agricultural products and consumer products, simply because we're closer, which will give us a competitive edge over.
What is the average per capita income?
That was that in your testimony?
Mr. Sleaze, the average, I believe the average per capita income is about 1/5 of that of the United States. So the per capita income in the United States is about $40,000, and that in Cuba is $8,000, $8,500. So there's no question consumer demand is not what's going to drive trade between the United States and Cuba. What's going to drive demand is infrastructure, wholesale commodities, and so on. And the U.S. it's less about filling holes. I think there are some holes, but it's less about filling holes than it is about the comparative advantage we have because of the reduced shipping costs. And I think rice is the single most dramatic example of that.
Right.
Gentleman's
And just
time
to
is
add to
expired.
that, the additional tourist arrivals, just for example, from the increased tourist demand for food, will boost domestic demand for U.S. products as well.
I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. If the witness will indulge us, we will go into a second round of questioning, and we will ask the members of the committee to restrict their questions to 2 minutes. And the chair recognizes himself. Ambassador Kaysen, what I see that you served in Venezuela and Bolivia during your career, outstanding public service, and have these two nations engaged in any form of nationalizations of their of companies and other entities, business entities?
Yes, Bolivia. Most recently.
Would you suggest that we create a trade embargo around these two nations?
No, I think that if you were starting today and said, would the trade embargo, if we were to launch it today, would it change Cuba's behavior? I think the answer would be no, and I think we've seen.
Why would you suggest that we continue the trade embargo against Cuba?
Well, first of all,
and let me ask the question, please. And also, why would we also have a similar practice as it relates to other countries that have significant human rights violations, extraordinary human rights violations in some instances?
As I said originally, the embargo was originally designed as a reaction to confiscation of American properties in Cuba, and it's evolved over the years. I think if you were to say what we know about the embargo today, if you started it fresh, would it induce somebody like Fidel Castro to bring democracy? Like every other policy in the world, of every variation that anybody else has tried, it hasn't. So to think that ending the embargo now would somehow induce Fidel Castro at this late stage in his life to become a Democrat or do any of the things that we say are our end game for Cuba, it's just not going to happen.
Time is up. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Radonovich, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jones, do have a question for you. You testified that there are about 500 international companies represented in Cuba with a substantial investment there. But according to the State Department, the business environment is so unfriendly that the number of joint ventures dropped from 540 in 1982 to 287 in 2005. Because of the government's re-centralization efforts, it is estimated that one joint venture and two small cooperative production ventures have closed each week since the year 2000, and foreign direct investment dropped from $448 million in the year 2000 to $39 million in 2001 and to zero in the year 2002. Are these 500 international companies independently owned, or are they joint ventures? And if they are joint ventures, why the difference between the State Department figures and your testimony? Can you help bridge that?
Yes, I'll try. First, the joint ventures have fallen even further, down to about 237 now. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that. Cuba, when it started into the joint venture business, which is 94, 95, they were in a learning process. There hadn't been a single joint venture in Cuba between 1959 and 1994. They were learning how to do this. And things changed over the times, and they learned what they wanted, what the country needed, which joint ventures contributed to its national economy, which they wanted to do and didn't do. And over the course of time, they began closing and not renewing and not entertaining small to medium-sized joint ventures, with a concentration on larger joint ventures of a much more strategic and nationally important basis. For that reason, many were closed, many ended, and the people left. Those 500 companies, I haven't got the breakdown as to which are representatives, which are sales agents, which are real estate partners. All I know is that there are offices there of non-U.S. companies for a variety of business reasons.
So you're saying that Castro now permits wholly owned private international businesses to operate without taking a cut?
Joint ventures are on generally a 50-50 basis. There have been some 100% foreign-owned joint ventures, particularly in the power generation area. Most of them, as I said, are 50-50, where the joint venture partner and the Cuban enterprise with which it has a contract forms a board, develops a business plan, sets up a business. Joint venture, the foreign partner can take its profits after taxes out of the country. And many, particularly in the oil, mining, and some of the areas that I mentioned earlier, are functioning very well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castro, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thaley, in your testimony, you state that some of the countries that currently trade with Cuba use their engagement to promote human rights. Provide an example for us, or a few examples of what other countries that are currently trading with Cuba are doing to promote human rights in Cuba.
Thank you for the question. The two most dramatic, I think, and most high visibility examples are Brazil and Spain. And in the case of Brazil, the President of Brazil visited Cuba last January. He pledged $1 billion in credits for trade and investments. And it's widely believed, including by U.S. government officials, that he began a dialogue with the Cuban political leadership about the release of political prisoners and about long-term political relaxation in Cuba itself. I think it's generally believed that President Lula has continued to raise those issues in all of his and his government's subsequent interactions with Cuba. So, again, I don't think Lula is expecting all 200 political prisoners to be released tomorrow, but I think that's an issue on the table for the Brazilians. I think Spain, as it's led the European Union's policy shift and re-engagement with Cuba, has had that issue on the table as well. And I think it's fairly clear that the release of political prisoners for Zapatero and the Spanish government is an important question. Again, I don't think they're going to have a sort of, we'll add a new trade deal, you'll release 4 political prisoners kind of thing. But I do think you've seen movement on this. And I think the historic example here, Congressman, is that if you look at the period in the year around the Pope's visit to Cuba, when the Vatican diplomacy focused on the political prisoner question. There was never any explicit deal made at all, but in that period, the number of political prisoners in prison in Cuba was reduced by about a third. Similarly, if you look at the period around when President Carter reopened the U.S. interest section in Havana, the number of Cuban political prisoners dropped significantly. So I think the evidence is that you do see movement on these kind of issues when there's consistent engagement, when there's real interaction, and when you're not looking for sort of precondition or tit-for-tat kind of concessions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador Kaysen and I really and others, the other ones, I really appreciate your testimony. I must say that I spent 4 hours in meetings with President Raul Castro and an hour and a half at the home of Fidel Castro, and had some extensive conversations with him. And I must agree with your other witnesses, Mrs. Rothkopf, Mr. Thale, and Mr. Jones. I certainly disagree with you about the mind of the Cuban people, the mind of Fidel Castro, and the mind of Raul Castro as it relates to normalization. I want to just say that in conclusion, it was very informative for me, a first-time visitor to Cuba. With that, the hearing is now concluded. I want to thank the witnesses for your presence. Thank you for appearing before us. And this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you. Good hearing. Good hearing.